Welcome to Fair Observer. We are a non-profit media organization with more than 2,500 voices from over 90 countries. With me today is one of our most eminent authors, James Dorsey. Now, many of you might have read him in the past. I have been reading him for many years. And James is an award-winning journalist. He's a commentator on foreign affairs. He's covered ethnic and religious conflict. He's covered terrorism. He's been a foreign correspondent for big names such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and yada yada. He's also written a book on the turbulent world of Middle East soccer. So as you can see, we couldn't have asked for a better speaker. And today, James will be speaking about the forthcoming FIFA World Cup. Many see this World Cup, many see this year actually as Qatar's year to put its best foot forward. This tiny country, Gulf country, is a major producer of natural gas. It is a key ally of the US. It also hosted the Taliban, and it was a key player in negotiating or being the middleman between the Taliban on one side and of course the US on another. Al Jazeera is funded by Qatar, and so Qatar is a country which has been able to come through a Saudi Emirati economic and diplomatic boycott. It is now hosting the World Cup, and yet there is an ointment, there's a fly in the ointment, and that is very simple. Human rights groups view this World Cup as an opportunity to increase pressure on Qatar to address their concerns. And the concerns are the usual: overworking of labor, perhaps exploitation. Actually, yes, exploitation is one of them, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I will take James take the stage, and he will be talking about the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar. Welcome, James. It's an honor to have you here.
Atul, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you. Indeed, Qatar, this year is Qatar's year to put its best foot forward. A major producer of natural gas, the tiny Gulf state is under the magnifying glass as it enters the final phase of hosting the 2022 World Cup and emerges as a potential part of efforts to reduce European dependence on Russian energy. On balance, Qatar looks like it has already succeeded, as much on its own steam as with the help of its erstwhile detractors in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Arab world, including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, over the past decade, much attention is focused on labor rights in the Gulf state as a result of world governing soccer bodies FIFA's awarding of the tournament hosting rights to Qatar in 2010. Qatar remains a target of criticism by human rights groups, despite implementing far-reaching reforms of its kafala or labor sponsorship system that long put workers at the mercy of their employers. The criticism is rooted in the Gulf states' weak implementation of the reforms, a problematic judicial system, a top-down centralized decision-making process, and poor handling of World Cup and sports-related incidents. Perceived as the underdog, confronted with demands that would have de facto deprived it of its independence, Qatar was lauded for its resilience and steadfastness that ultimately persuaded the UAE and Saudi Arabia to end their diplomatic and economic boycott of the Gulf state in January of last year. Since then, Qatar was awarded for its key role in assisting the United States in negotiating its withdrawal from Afghanistan and in its bungled departure from the country, with the US nominating it as a major non-NATO ally. Qatar is one of a handful of Muslim states to enjoy that status. It ranks Qatar among the United States' closest allies, alongside Australia and Japan, and opens the door to more joint military exercises and potential arms sales. The nomination took on added significance at a time that Gulf states worry about United States efforts to rejigger and reduce its security commitments in the region, and strike a deal with Iran on reviving the 2015 international nuclear agreement that curbed the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. Some of that concern is likely to be addressed during US President Joe Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia today and tomorrow. Revival of the nuclear deal would lift many US sanctions against Iran and return it to the international fold without addressing Iran's ballistic missiles program and support for militias in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, as well as Syria's Bashar al-Assad, issues that are of major concern for Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. Meanwhile, Qatar has earned brownie points in the Ukraine crisis, despite keeping its lines open to Moscow and refraining from adopting US and European sanctions against Russia. In contrast to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which essentially refused US requests to increase oil production to stop prices from spiraling out of control, Qatar has started talks with Germany, France, Belgium, and Italy about long-term liquefied natural gas supplies that would help Europe reduce its dependence on Russian energy. In contrast to the geopolitical balance sheet that works in Qatar's favor, an evaluation in the final year of the run-up to the 2022 World Cup of the campaign to reform the country's erstwhile onerous labor system and accommodate fans whose lifestyles violate restrictive laws and or go against deeply rooted cultural attitudes is more of a mixed bag. That is true, even if one takes into account that Qatari autocracy has proven to be more responsive and flexible in responding to pressure by human rights and labor groups than its fellow autocrats in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. On the plus side of the balance sheet, the initial wave of condemnation of Qatar's repressive kafala labor system persuaded the Gulf state to become the first in the region, if not the first Arab state, to engage its critics. Engagement meant giving human rights groups and trade unions access to the country, allowing them to operate and hold news conferences in Qatar, and involving them in drafting reforms and World Cup-related model labor contracts. This was unprecedented in a region where local activists are behind bars or worse, and foreign critics don't even make it onto an inbound flight. Furthermore, on the plus side, the hosting rights sparked limited but nonetheless taboo-breaking discussions that touched on sensitive subjects such as LGBT rights and the granting of citizenship to non-nationals. Qataris openly questioned the granting of citizenship to foreign athletes so they could be included in the Qatar national team for the 2016 Olympics, rather than to medical personnel and other professionals who had contributed to national welfare and development. Hosting the World Cup has also forced Qatar, albeit in a limited fashion, to come to some sort of grips with issues like LGBT rights that do not simply violate the country's laws, but go against its social grain to produce an inclusive tournament. In some ways, that may have been more difficult than reforming the labor regime if one considers the difference between standing up for democratic freedoms that may have broader public support and the socially far more sensitive and controversial issue of recognition of LGBT rights. In contrast to democratic rights, opposition to LGBT rights is deeply ingrained in Qatar and other Muslim societies. They would likely be socially rejected, even if they were enshrined in law. The difference means that the defense of LGBT and other socially controversial rights forces activists and human and LGBT rights groups to rethink their strategies and adopt alternative, more long-term approaches. It also means that they will have to embrace less Western-centric attitudes, frequently prevalent in the campaign to reform Qatar's labor system. Those attitudes were evident in debates that were also often skewed by bias, prejudice, bigotry, and sour grapes. Moreover, the criticism often failed to consider the context. As a result, achieving results and pushing for reform was to a degree undermined by what appeared to be a ganging up on Qatar and a singling out of the Gulf state. Labor is an example. Human rights groups and trade unions treated onerous labor conditions in Qatar, even if the World Cup turned it into a prime target, as uniquely Qatari, rather than a global problem that manifests itself in other parts of the world, such as Southeast Asia, and even Western democracies like Britain. Recent reporting by The Guardian showed that expatriate medical and caregiver personnel face similar curtailing of rights and abuse in Britain. By the same token, Qatar was taken to task for being slow in implementing its reforms and ensuring that they were applied not only to World Cup projects, but nationwide. The fact is that lagging enforcement of policies and legal changes is a problem across the broad spectrum of Qatari policies and reform and soft power efforts, including the Gulf states' high-profile, fast-paced, mediation-driven foreign policy. Qatar's handling of illegal recruitment fees paid by workers is a case in point. Despite Qatar's outlawing of forcing migrant workers, a majority of the Gulf states' population, to pay exorbitant recruitment fees of up to a year's worth of wages, workers have collectively paid billions of dollars to secure employment over the last decade. Qatar opened recruitment centers in 8 labor supplying countries to ensure that recruitment would meet ethical standards in line with recommendations made by a Qatar Foundation study. The centers have reduced the risk of employment terms in workers' contracts being unilaterally changed, but have been unable to curb the leveling of recruitment fees. In an effort to compensate workers, the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, the Qatari organizer of the World Cup, has obliged companies in contracts to repay the fees without workers having to provide proof of payment. Companies have so far pledged to repay roughly $28.5 million to some 49,000 workers, 22 million of which have already been paid out. It is a step the government could have applied nationally with relative ease to demonstrate sincerity and more fundamentally counter the criticism. Similarly, in response to complaints raised by human rights groups and others, the government could have also offered to compensate families of workers who die on construction sites. None of these measures would have dented Qatari budgets, but would have earned the Gulf state immeasurable goodwill. Discussing conditions of workers in Qatar, respected sports journalist James Corbett noted that to the outside world, they are slave laborers, ruthlessly exploited, put in mortal danger day after day. Luck ever to make it out of Qatar alive. The reality, at least on World Cup sites, is different. The idea that the World Cup was being built by chain gangs overseen by barbaric gangmasters, as if in a contemporaneous version of ancient Rome or Greece's slavery, was always a fallacy, Corbett noted. The consequence of singling out Qatar without putting it in a broader context was that initial Qatari willingness to work with its critics weakened as attitudes hardened. Increasingly self-confident, Qatar engaged less with its critics and responded to criticism more aggressively. That was evident at the FIFA Congress in Doha in March, when Supreme Committee Secretary General Hassan al-Thawadi responded to critical remarks by Lise Klaveness, the head of the Norwegian Football Association, by saying, "We're not seeking validation. Legacy is being delivered as we speak. We've showcased to the world what tournament hosting can do." Noting that the criticism had become more ferocious since Qatar first launched its bid in 2009, Qatar 2022 CEO Nasser Al-Khatta predicted that by the time the World Cup starts, it's all going to be about football, and the criticism is going to go to the side. That may or may not be true. Reflecting on coverage of the 11 years since Qatar was awarded the World Cup hosting rights, Corbett, the journalist, noted that what hadn't changed was the sense of outrage at Qatar's host status, more in Europe than anywhere else. European football associations voiced their criticism all the way up to the tournament. The facade of the headquarters of France's Football Federation sported a banner proclaiming that thousands have died in Qatar, while the Danish Association agreed with its sponsors to withdraw their brands from the World Cup. Fans called for a boycott of the tournament. In Britain, newspaper compared the Qatar World Cup to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's hosting of the tournament in 1934 and Adolf Hitler's Olympics in Berlin 2 years later. Qatar has done itself no favors in its dealings with the media, with its often evasive and mediocre responses to inquiries and intermittent efforts to inhibit independent reporting and suppress what Qatari officials would consider negative stories. Qatar's handling of the case of Abdullah Ibhez, the Supreme Committee's Jordanian-Palestinian Deputy Communications Director, who opposed putting a spin on a strike by migrant workers, including some assigned to World Cup-related projects, is a case in point. The workers were on strike because their salaries had not been paid. Ibhez was subsequently accused of leaking state secrets and awarding a social media tender to a Turkish bidder in return for Turkish citizenship. He asserts that he was forced to sign a confession and was initially refused access to a lawyer. Ibhez was sentenced to 5 years in prison based on evidence that, according to Human Rights Watch, was vague, circumstantial, and in some cases contradictory. However, an appeals court subsequently reduced his sentence to 3 years in jail. The Ibhez case will confirm the suspicions of many that the primary purpose of Qatar's World Cup organizers has been to protect the country's reputation, no matter the cost to the migrant workers building the tournament or anyone who stands up for their rights, asserted Norwegian journalist Havard Melnes. Qatar's cost-benefit analysis is often skewed, as its repressive and defensive actions cause greater reputational damage than the incidents it tries to suppress. It remains an open question whether Qatar is driven by bad faith, ill will, and lack of political will, or ineptitude that gets it stuck in a rout. In the most extensive published investigation to date of the Ibhez case, journalist Corbett concluded that allegations of irregularities in the Ibhez case had merit, but that his sentencing had little to do with workers' rights and everything to do with crossing a powerful figure in the Gulf state who had lost his bid for the social media contract. To be sure, Qatar has, in response to criticism and as part of its preparations for the World Cup, adopted far-reaching labor reforms that significantly improved conditions for unskilled and semi-skilled workers, even if they may not have gone far enough in the minds of human rights and trade union activists, and at least initially were unevenly implemented. The measures taken have already improved the working and living conditions for hundreds of thousands of workers, and additional efforts are needed to ensure that all workers can benefit, said the International Labour Organization, or ILO. It added that the most problematic and restrictive elements of the kafala or sponsorship system were dismantled. The ILO highlighted the abolishment of the exit visa for leaving the country and the requirement to get an employer's permission to change jobs. The ILO reported that between September 2020 and March 2022, more than 300,000 laborers, including 7,000 domestic workers, had been able to change jobs because of the reforms. The ILO further pointed to the region's first introduction of a minimum wage that increased the basic income of 280,000 workers, or 13% of the workforce. The creation of an online complaint system led to a more than doubling of complaints from 11,000 in 2020 to 25,000 in 2021. In another regional first, migrant workers are being elected as representatives in the workplace. In addition, staff of 5 global union federations are based in Doha, working as community liaison officers. Labor inspectors monitor implementation of the reforms. Labor issues were, in a sense, low-hanging fruit. Sexual and gender diversity are far more sensitive. When Egyptian football legend Mohamed Abu Trika came out swinging against homosexuality in late 2021, he touched a raw nerve across the Muslim world. The tit for tat between Abu Trika and supporters of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights laid bare a yawning gap. For Abu Trika and many in the Muslim world, the issue is adhering to their values and rejecting attempts to impose the values of others. For supporters of LGBT rights and LGBT soccer fans, at stake most immediately is LGBT people's right to attend the 2022 World Cup without fear of discrimination or legal entanglement because of their sexuality. Longer term, it's about ensuring of LGBT rights, including social acceptability, inclusivity, and non-discrimination. Solving the problem may not be a lower hanging fruit. However, it may also open a pathway for what is realistically achievable in the middle term. The reality is that what may be realistically possible is at best akin to US President Bill Clinton's application to gays in the US military of the don't ask, don't tell rule, or Indonesia's de facto live and let live principle. That may not be satisfactory, but it may be the only thing that for now is possible without putting LGBT communities at risk by provoking public hostility and backlash. To be sure, autocratic Middle Eastern regimes like Saudi Arabia and Egypt often target LGBT communities for domestic political gain. In addition, the United Arab Emirates, perhaps the Middle East's socially most liberal society, recently backtracked on LGBT-related issues. The trick in campaigning for LGBT rights is avoiding playing into the hands of autocrats while maintaining the pressure. Simply attempting to impose recognition is unlikely to produce results. Instead, a more realistic strategy may be to devise ways to stimulate debate in Muslim-majority countries and encourage social change bottom up to ensure public buy-in. That worked to a degree as human rights groups and trade unions used the World Cup to pressure Qatar to make changes to its labor regime. LGBT rights are in a different category and relate more directly, rightly or wrongly, to perceived religious precepts. As such, what worked with labor rights, even if human rights groups would like to see more far-reaching reforms, is unlikely to produce similar results when it comes to LGBT rights. Going to extremes, Saudi Arabia, amid a push to encourage tourism, recently launched rainbow raids on shops selling children's toys and accessories. Authorities targeted clothing and toys, including hair clips, poppets, t-shirts, bows, skirts, hats, and coloring pencils that contradict the Islamic faith and public morals and promote homosexual colors that target the younger generation, said a Commerce Ministry official. Earlier, the kingdom, like the UAE, banned Lightyear, a Disney and Pixar animated production, because of a same-sex kiss scene, and Disney's Doctor Strange in the Universe of Madness, in which one character refers to her two mums. The UAE ban appeared to contradict the government's announcement in late 2021 that it would end the censorship of films. The country's media regulatory office said it would introduce a 21+ age viewer classification policy instead. However, that wasn't evident when the office recently tweeted an image of Lightyear crossed out with a red line. Human Rights Watch has repeatedly charged that Egyptian police and National Security Agency officers arbitrarily arrest LGBT people and detain them in inhuman conditions, systematically subject them to ill treatment, including torture, and often incite fellow inmates to abuse them. With the World Cup only a few months away, Qatar was caught in a catch-22. In a country with a few gays willing to speak out, describe an environment of social and legal discrimination, Qatari authorities wanted to see the World Cup finals as an interlude of live and let live. Officials have insisted in recent years that LGBT fans would be welcome during the World Cup, but would be expected to respect norms that frown on public expressions of affection, irrespective of sexual orientation. Paul Aman, the founder of Liverpool FC's LGBT supporters club, Cop Outs, met in 2019 with Qatari World Cup organizers before traveling to Doha with his husband to evaluate the situation. I'm very satisfied that their approach is to provide an everyone is welcome ethos that does include respect, albeit through privacy. I'm not sure if rainbow flags generally will ever be accepted in country, but maybe in stadia, Aman said upon his return. Abu Treka put Qatar on the spot when he asserted in November 2021 that our role is to stand up to this phenomenon, homosexuality, because it's a dangerous ideology and it's becoming nasty and people are not ashamed of it anymore. The Premier League will tell you that homosexuality is human rights. No, it is not human rights. In fact, it's against humanity. The Qatari parliament and state-aligned media, imams in Saudi mosques, Saudi diplomats, and Al-Azhar, the citadel of Islamic learning in Cairo, rallied to reiterate Abu Treka's condemnation, despite his allegedly Islamist leanings. Abu Treka's remarks were in response to Australian gay footballer Josh Cavallo, who revived the sexuality debate when he declared that he would be afraid to play in the Qatar World Cup because of the Gulf states' ban on homosexuality and harsh penalties on its books, ranging from flogging to lengthy prison sentences. One of the few players to discuss his sexuality publicly, Cavallo expressed his concern a month after coming out as gay. Cavallo said other footballers had privately expressed similar fears. A report on state-sponsored homophobia issued by the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, or ILGA World, noted in December 2020 that religious interpretations of Qatari law could enable the sentencing of gays to death. It also stated that other articles stipulate sentences of up to 10 years in prison. The report went on to say, while there are no reported cases of the death penalty being applied for consensual same-sex sexual activity in Qatar as of October 2020, there are local testimonies indicating that LGBTI people living in Qatar face an extremely hostile context. Majid al-Qatari, a pseudonym for a Qatari gay, sparked outrage in 2011 by writing an article describing what it meant to be homosexual in the Gulf state. Al-Qatari noted that many had lauded the attack on a gay bar in Orlando, Florida that year by describing gays as God's cursed people. It is very jarring living here. It is traumatizing to see that you are cause of your parents' anguish, that you are shaming your family. It is a constant onslaught and it's killing me. It has caused irreparable damage to my mental health. I wouldn't have chosen to have been born in a place where my life is tantamount to my death. There is no prospect or future for me here, no normalcy, Al-Qatari said. What is evident in the sexuality debate is that few people, if any, will be convinced by arguments raised by the opposing side in what amounts to a dialogue of the deaf. Both sides of the divide feel deeply about their positions. For proponents of LGBT rights, the challenge is to develop strategies that may contribute to change rather than insisting on a path that is more likely to deepen the trench lines than produce results for the people it is really about, the LGBT community. Thank you. I hope this provides food for thought and for the discussion, and I look forward to that.
James, thank you for such a detailed and rigorous presentation. Now, let me straight away crack on. I mean, look, human rights or a lot of the other rights in the Gulf they are not ideal because these are, at the end of the day, monarchies, and Qatar is no exception. And so do you think that all these use of human rights or LGBT is just yet another part of the geopolitical football game, which goes on between all these different rivals in the region and elsewhere, perhaps?
Well, I think it's more layered. So I think that there is, on the part of a lot of the activists, genuine concern.
Mm-hmm.
And a true belief in wanting to stand up for human rights and whatever other rights. I think that obviously you can argue that larger powers, primarily the United States, uses the issue of human rights selectively. So it raises the issues more forcefully with countries with which it has differences, and less forcefully with countries that it has various interests, whether that's a country like Egypt, a country like Saudi Arabia, certainly now with the visit of Biden, or
Biden's just chucked his democracy. I mean, he's just flushed his democracy agenda down the toilet. He's gone to meet Mohammed bin Salman for oil.
Absolutely. However, having said that, there is also a lot of geopolitical playing.
Of course, I mean, he's already announced that he's willing to use violence to stop Iran going nuclear.
Let me make a point.
Yeah.
With the United States, it's evident. It's out there. You don't have to go look for it. The United States is actually very transparent about it.
That's true.
Countries that are less transparent about it are countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. That over the last 10 years have waged a covert campaign against holding of the World Cup hosting rights. To give you an example, several years ago, two British researchers of Nepalese origin, working for an obscure NGO, were arrested in Qatar as they investigated human rights. Brian Whitaker and myself were the two journalists who disclosed what was behind that. The NGO was headed by a Palestinian national who was resident originally in Abu Dhabi, became a Swedish citizen, founded a university with 500 professors in his living room. With UAE aid, had been accredited as an observer status at the United Nations, maintained an office in Brussels run by a corrupt former member of the European Parliament, and an office in Geneva. And on the basis of Brian and my reporting, the Norwegian authorities raided the NGO, confiscated or froze $20 million. And so it was clear that this was an attempt to undermine Qatar's reputation, possibly undermine its. And so what I'm trying to say with this is, yes, you're right, geopolitics plays a big role here, or an important role, but it's not just where we tend to look at the United States.
Understood. So let's get to a key issue, which, in fact, I was discussing with some people who are in the CIA and in MI6. And one of them wryly remarked that the Al-Thanis and the Al-Sauds can't stand the sight of each other. And the Al-Sauds would like to flush Qatar into the Gulf and be done with it. They see Qatar as a feudatory who's now become too big for their boots. And Qatar, of course, sees itself as, or the Al-Thanis see themselves as, the modernizing family in the Gulf who are taking the Islamic world to another level. After all, Al Jazeera is their play in the global narrative game. And they're the only ones who are offering a credible challenge in some ways to the BBC and the other big organizations of the West. So, and you've already said that, of course, there was a covert operation by UAE and and Saudi Arabia, and there was not so covert sanctions and really trying to throttle the Qatari economy. And so how bitter is this feud, and where do you see this game going? And does the World Cup give Qatar an edge against its seemingly more unsavory rivals?
I think there's several aspects to this. First of all, I would agree with your sources that there are major tensions underlying the Qatari-Saudi relationship. I think you've got to understand why those tensions are. First of all, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are the only two Wahhabi states in the world. The Saudis follow traditionally what was called Wahhabiyya al-Ard, the Wahhabism of the land, versus Wahhabiyya al-Bahr, the Wahhabism of the sea in Qatar. Qatar is a small country sandwiched between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It has to have dealings with both, but both of them constitute threats. And that has played a role from day one in Qatar's, in the formation of, and the DNA of the Qatari state. That's one. Two, Qatar's response to all of this is essentially a soft power policy. If you go back and you talk to US defense contractors prior to 2014, when the Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain first withdrew their embassies from Doha, defense contractors would tell you, we engage with the Qataris. They go all the way, but they stop short of buying of signing a contract. That's changed since 2014 because circumstances changed. But what it tells you is that the Qataris saw their defense and security not in hard defense. Fact of the matter is, you can have the most sophisticated weaponry in a classic conventional war, i.e. set pieces on a battleground, heavy equipment, lots of men, 300,000 people isn't going to do it no matter what weapons you have. So the model was Kuwait 1990, when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. Traditional Kuwaitis sat it out in Saudi Arabia, less traditional Kuwaitis sat it out in the casino in Cairo, and the rest of the world liberated the country. That's the model. Now, the third layer of this is that you have a very different Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman. He wants Saudi Arabia to be the dominant force in the region. And you see that in his sports policy, you see that in his backtracking on the access that free trade zone companies in the UAE get in terms of tariff-free export of goods. You see that in trying to force corporations to move their headquarters from Dubai to Saudi Arabia. So, you know, that's what it is about, I think, much more than, gee, these guys hate each other and it's all tribal, if you wish, to put it somewhat facetious.
Understood. I mean, it's a simplification, but let's go back to what you've just said. Mohammed bin Salman represents a new Saudi Arabia. By the way, we have a big article about his shady dealings with Airbus. Apparently, he's behind a deal that is buying $8 billion worth of Airbus for $12 billion. And this is an Arab Digest article. And the $4 billion will be pocketed by him and Turkey and his brothers. And the idea is that, of course, he's creating a monarchy in which there's primogeniture. The power goes to him and then to his son, and it's his side of the family that'll be in charge. And of course, as he's dominant at home, he wants to be dominant in the region. How does that affect Qatar? How will Qatar respond? Of course, the World Cup is part of it, increasing soft power. Al Jazeera is another. And Qatar, as you said, has done very well in keeping lines open to Moscow and at the same time exporting natural gas. But what is the new challenge that MBS brings to Qatar, and how will the Qataris respond?
Well, first of all, I think it's not only a challenge he brings to Qatar.
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenge that he brings to the other Gulf states.
I see. Including the UAE, who are nominally his allies.
That's true certainly for Kuwait,
Okay.
for Oman, less true for Bahrain,
Mm-hmm.
which is heavily influenced by Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And heavily.
And Bahrain, isn't it a Sunni monarchy ruling over a Shia majority?
Yes, it is.
So they are
The
very
UAE, vulnerable. The UAE, as you know, at one point there's when Yusuf Al Otaiba, the UAE ambassador to Washington, when his emails leaked, he was very derogative about the Saudis at the very moment that he was promoting Mohammed bin Salman, and made the interesting statement of, we, the UAE, have been fighting Wahhabism for the last 200 years. I think that the UAE, in many ways, plays its cards differently. It is, whatever one thinks about the UAE and about Mohammed bin Zayed, it is the cutting edge state in the country, in the region. Again, whatever one thinks of it, Mohammed bin Zayed clearly has vision. You may not like the vision, you may disagree with the vision, you may like parts of it, it doesn't matter. There is vision. And so he has forged much more of a middle line of, on the one hand, pushing the UAE forward on issues which are hard, on which Saudi Arabia can compete, but it's harder for it to compete. Issues of projection of tolerance and religious tolerance, and one can question that religious tolerance and what it's based on, but nonetheless, whether he's done that through recognizing Israel, whether he's done that through promoting a Jewish community in the UAE, building Sikh and Hindu temples, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, he's also forging a course that's different and divergent at times from Saudi Arabia. Just look at Yemen. The Yemen war for Saudi Arabia was about countering the Houthis, both because of the threat that the Houthis as such posed and because of their links to Iran. For the UAE, this was about creating a geopolitical base along some of the world's most important waterways. And in fact, if you look at reports of the last few days, the allegation is that the Emiratis are depopulating the island of Socotra and replacing the local population with people more akin to the Emiratis, and that Yemeni workers who want to come to Socotra, being part of Yemen, their own country, now have to get permits, and that those permits are issued under UAE guidance. So what you're seeing is a relationship that is far more complex, but where the UAE is also very careful not to break ranks with the kingdom.
So let's get back to Qatar. Qatar, the World Cup will come in 2022, as you've said. By that time, all the stock of human rights and all the labor rights and all the other Achilles heel of Qatar will disappear. The stadiums will be full, or the stadia will be full, and Qatar would have achieved its purpose. What next? They've already bought PSG. Qatar has bought, of course, Mohammed bin Salman has bought Newcastle. What next transpires after this? Is this part of a long-term strategy for Qatar?
I think you've got to realize that the Qatari approach to sports is far more strategic than anything that the Emiratis or the Saudis are doing.
But don't the Emiratis own Manchester United, and haven't they done brilliantly?
Manchester City.
Sorry, my apologies. Yeah, Manchester City.
But there are some major differences. The Saudis are Johnny come lately to the game, and they're trying to buy their way into it. And part of that serves a much more important domestic function, which is demonstrating to the world that the kingdom is not the kingdom it was prior to 2015, and providing entertainment and trying to cater to aspirations of Saudi youth. The Emiratis have gone about this very commercial. So they have turned the acquisition. They were the first to do an acquisition like that of Manchester City into a global franchise.
Yeah.
They brought the Chinese into it. They have tried and were only successful with the Cricket Federation to get international federations to move to the UAE. The UAE has looked at this as one, becoming part of national identity, and of creating a sports culture, a sports culture in the country, and secondly, a sports industry, so sports medicine, sports security, all of these issues. I think that what you're going to see in Qatar is, first of all, I don't think that you will see what some people fear, a rollback of labor rights and whatever, once the World Cup is over. I think, in fact, you're going to see bids for more such mega events, possibly the Olympics. And I think you're going to see that the Qataris are going to continue to want to leverage what they have already achieved and build on it.
So, from the sounds of it, the two key players in the sports industry business and the sports culture business and sports as soft power are the UAE and Qatar. The UAE has already done a great deal with Manchester City. They have a global franchise. And Qatar, of course, will leverage the World Cup to stamp its imprint on the world of football, because the World Cup is the biggest spectacle. It's much bigger than Premier League. And then it may make play for the Olympics.
Well, I think there are three major players.
Mm-hmm.
The third one is Saudi Arabia, and look at what Saudi Arabia has recently done with the Gulf League. It, together with the UAE, put up $25 billion through SoftBank, the Japanese venture capital company, to try and create new FIFA tournaments, which would have increased Saudi influence in sports governance. Look at F1. So I think there are three major, and of course the acquisition of Newcastle. So there are three major players in the region. And I would put the Saudis today, even if they're Johnny-come-lately, as I said, I would put them on par with the Qataris and the Emiratis, even if the Qataris and the Emiratis have a first starter advantage. What the Saudis, of course, have is that they are the custodian of the two holy cities, Mecca and Medina, and they are, of course, the largest and most powerful country in the region.
Got it.
And the largest economy, of course.
I mean, the oil prices are booming, so that's great for the Saudis. So, a question for you. What are the pitfalls? Because on the one hand, sport is becoming more democratic, more egalitarian. But on the other hand, at least when it comes to Saudi Arabia, its reputation under MBS has taken a massive blow, particularly after Khashoggi was cut up in Istanbul. So can there be sports washing by Saudi Arabia, or is MBS a little too blackened by soot for his robes to turn white?
It didn't stop the Saudis from buying Newcastle. And there was a fair amount of support. In fact, the seemingly majority support among the fans. They didn't care about Jamal or whatever the Saudis do. Yeah. So I don't now, but I have a more fundamentally, I don't use the term sports washing.
Okay.
And sports washing is just the newest fad. Before that, it was reputation laundering.
Yeah, fair enough. I concur. It's just
I think the problem with it is it simplifies or oversimplifies what the sports policy is about. So if take Qatar. Qatar didn't have major reputational problems prior to the, or not more than any other country, prior to the winning of the World Cup rights. It was the World Cup, and again, I mean, the media are guilty in this. I wrote my first article about the Gulf labor and used the term apartheid in 1976. We've known this for a long time. It just was not an issue, and became an issue with the World Cup. So, with other words, whether Qatar realized or not that by winning the World Cup, it was going to put itself in the spotlight, that's what it did. It would not have been under that spotlight, at least not with regard to human rights, maybe with regard to its policies and relations with all kinds of groups and so on and so forth. But it would not have been under more scrutiny with regard to labor rights or other rights or human rights than any other country in the region. And so the issue then is, one, how did it deal with it? And two, in the final analysis, did the World Cup produce results that Qatar wanted? Now, I think that Qatar, there's a problem with Qatar. It's not a Qatari problem, but there's a problem with Qatar. Qatar, so there are a number of states in the world, think of Iran, that whether you know anything about Iran, whether you care about it, it evokes a response. You have a view of Iran. Mm-hmm. You think it's either evil incorporated or whatever. Qatar is the same thing. There is, to a degree, what happened over the last 10 years in the UAE and Saudis contributed to that, and their allies, a demonization of the country. I would argue at the end of the day that those that are fundamentally till today opposed to Qatar and fall in the ilk of what James Corbett, the journalist that I was quoting in my remarks, said, this is slave labor a la Romans and Greeks. They actually do fulfill, even if they're wrong in my mind, they fulfill a constructive function because they hold people to the fire. It's a double-edged sword, because if that becomes the tone, then you're also going to close off doors to trying to continue a process of change. But I think in the ultimate balance, the Qataris have earned a lot of credit. I think, and the trick for them will be to maintain what they're doing and maintain their relations with human rights groups. And in fact, last week, Human Rights Watch was back in Qatar to try and mend fences, work things out, post World Cup 2020. So I think it's a question here of engagement. Let the militants who are opposed indeed hold people to the fire, but it's going to be a question of continued engagement.
Now, we may have questions from the audience. We don't have any yet, but Qatar has demonstrated improvement, and the UAE has won great points on tolerance. But the Saudis haven't exactly established themselves with glory, particularly with MBS triggering the war in Yemen, his persecution of any potential rival or dissident, and of course chopping up people in embassies in a different land. And so are UAE and Qatar going to increase their soft power, and does Saudi Arabia not need to care because it has all the soft power in the world it needs because of Mecca and Medina?
Mecca and Medina gives it soft power in certain parts of the world.
Yeah, in the whole Islamic world.
But but even there, responses to the Saudis are mixed. The Saudis in the Muslim world are not necessarily the most respected, even if they are the custodians. But I think your question goes to a much more fundamental point, which really has little to do with sports and everything to do with the geopolitics, if you wish, of religious tolerance. The fact of the matter is that nothing that the UAE have done, or nothing that the Saudis have done, is grounded in religion, religious reform, or theology. It's changing of social norms, done not with religious, sure, endorsed by clerics and religious scholars, but not argued in terms of Islamic law or anything. The Saudis have a bit of a longer way to go. So you have all these houses of worship, many of them now government funded in the UAE. You still cannot build a non-Muslim house of worship in Saudi Arabia. However, Western states and Israel, as well as aligned religious communities, whether that's Jewish communities or Christian communities, are willing to project this religious toleration because it serves their geopolitical interests. So we talk about the UAE, Bahrain, and others having established diplomatic relations with Qatar, with Israel, and Qatar refusing to do so. Having said that, keep in mind the first direct Gulf investment in Israel proper, with other words, Israel prior to the 1967 borders, was a Qatari funding of a stadium in a Palestinian town in the Galilee. Qatar supports salaries in Hamas-controlled Gaza because the Israelis want them to do so. So, with other words, the Qataris may not engage in diplomatic relations with the Israelis, even though they had an Israeli representative office in Doha until I think it was 2009, but don't hold me to that. And basically, with one of the Lebanon wars with Hezbollah, one of the Gaza wars, was closed down. So, with other words, it's not like you have a hardline state here that is opposing politics. It's a state that pursues its interests in a different way, but in ways that are as of much interest to, for example, the United States and Israel as they are to the Qataris and the Palestinians.
Well, we've run out of time. James, we could have carried on forever. This was a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot. Especially, I love the layered and nuanced way of your thinking. For those of us who will watch this on YouTube, I would request all of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media. Thank you, James. It's been an honor. We hope to have you back very soon.
It's my pleasure. If I may, will you allow me to make a plug for my newsletter?
Please.
I'd like to invite anybody who's interested to subscribe to my newsletter, The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer, on Substack. You can do so by going to www.jamesmdorsey.substack.com. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I look forward to continuing to cooperate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All the best, and we'll see you soon.
All the best.